It was June 22nd, 1941, the day Operation Barbarossa erupted across the eastern frontier of Europe. 3 million Axis troops surged into the Soviet Union in the largest invasion in history. Yet far to the north, beyond the Arctic Circle, another, quieter front was being prepared. One that would decide the fate of a single port, Murmansk. Few outside Hitler's inner circle understood its importance. Murmansk was the Soviet Union's only ice-free port on the Arctic Ocean, a gateway that would soon connect the Red Army to Western supplies. If that lifeline were severed, the northern flank of the USSR could be strangled before it even had a chance to fight back. The plan was codenamed Operation Silver Fox. Unternehmen Silberfuchs. In German, Hopeketu to the Finns. It was an audacious, multi-pronged offensive conceived in secrecy between Berlin and Helsinki. The operation's roots stretch back to the uneasy alliance that had formed after the Winter War of 1939–40. Finland, humiliated by its defeat against the Soviet Union, sought both revenge and the recovery of lost territory. For Germany, the Finnish frontier offered something even more valuable, a northern springboard from which to strike Murmansk. Hitler's orders were clear. The Arctic assault would unfold in 3 phases. Operation Reindeer, the occupation of Petsamo and its vital nickel mines. Operation Platinum Fox, the German push eastward along the Arctic coast to Murmansk. And Operation Arctic Fox, a joint Finnish-German thrust from Salla toward Kandalaksha, aimed at cutting the Murmansk railway far to the south. If all went according to plan, the 2 spearheads would meet, severing the Soviet supply corridor completely. Murmansk would be isolated, and with it, the Soviet hope for Western aid. At the center of the operation stood one man, General Edvard Dietl. A decorated veteran of the 1940 Norwegian campaign, known for his charisma and iron discipline, Dietl was beloved by his men of the Gebirgskorps Norwegen, the elite German mountain corps trained for snow and rock, not for the endless tundra. His units included the famed 2nd and 3rd Mountain Divisions, veterans of Narvik. They were supported by elements of the 169th Infantry Division, Luftwaffe air units, and Finnish detachments familiar with the frozen wilderness. From the beginning, Silver Fox faced almost insurmountable challenges. The Arctic summer brought 24 hours of daylight, robbing the attackers of cover. The terrain offered no roads, no shelter, and little food. The mountains near the Litsa River were covered in jagged stone and swampy muskeg. Every weapon, every crate of ammunition had to be hauled by hand or mule through waist-deep mud. Even before the first shot was fired, attrition had begun. On the Soviet side, the Haupt's 14th Army, under Lieutenant General Valerian Frolov, garrisoned Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula. Its forces were thinly spread, about 52,000 men scattered over hundreds of kilometers, and its supply lines were primitive. The Soviets relied heavily on local knowledge, with naval infantry, engineers, and even Arctic hunters pressed into service. Few expected the Germans to attack through such inhospitable ground. Frolov later wrote, "The Arctic was our shield. We believed no army could cross it." But Hitler's directive demanded otherwise. On Eiffel, June 29, 1941, a week after Barbarossa began, the northern assault was launched. From Petsamo, Dietl's mountain troops crossed the border, supported by artillery and dive bombers of Luftflotte 5. The crackle of gunfire echoed across the tundra, a sound not heard there since the Russian Civil War. At the same hour, Finnish forces in the south moved towards Salla under General Hjalmar Silasvuo, pushing against the Soviet 122nd Rifle Division. Silver Fox had begun. For the Germans, the opening days brought optimism. The 2nd Mountain Division advanced quickly, capturing the Soviet border posts and reaching the western banks of the Litsa River. Within 48 hours, a company commander wrote in his diary, "The sea is close. We can smell it." From their forward positions, some troops could see the faint glimmer of Murmansk's lights across the horizon, but that would be as close as they would ever come. The farther they pushed, the more the Arctic revealed its hostility. The rivers were swollen with meltwater, and Soviet engineers blew bridges as they retreated. German supply convoys bogged down, radios froze, and ammunition ran short. The Luftwaffe struggled to locate targets through the mist that rolled in from the Barents Sea. Even Dietl, usually unshakable, began to realize the enormity of the task. He wired his superiors in Oslo. Advance continues, but terrain beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, the Soviet 52nd Rifle Division counterattacked from fortified positions east of the Litza. The Germans discovered that the Red Army's morale had not collapsed as Hitler had predicted. The Soviets fought with a ferocity born of desperation, using terrain and weather as their greatest weapons. Soviet naval guns from the Murmansk coast opened fire inland, their shells howling over the frozen ridges. The German advance slowed, then stopped. By the first week of July, both sides were locked in a grim stalemate. Casualties mounted, and reinforcements were nearly impossible to move across the Arctic. The official German war diary recorded simply, "Front stable, Murmansk still beyond reach." Yet within this frozen struggle lay a deeper mystery. Several patrols sent to flank Soviet positions vanished entirely. No radio contact, no trace. The Arctic absorbed them, leaving only questions. Did they perish in the tundra, or were they captured and buried in the endless ice? As the midnight sun burned low over the horizon, Dietl's men dug in among the rocks, their faces wind-chapped and eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Murmansk glimmered just beyond the horizon, so close, yet untouchable. The Arctic assault had begun, but the campaign's outcome would depend on what happened next. Deep inside the fog and silence of the Litza front. By early July 1941, the northern summer burned bright and endless. The Arctic sun refused to set, casting its cold light across the tundra, where German mountain troops struggled eastward from Petsamo. Their objective, Murmansk, was less than 100 kilometers away, yet it might as well have been a world apart. The offensive, known as Operation Platinum Fox, was now in motion, spearheaded by the Gebirgskorps Norwegen under General Eduard Dietl. South of them, another force, Finnish and German, advanced through the forests around Salla in Operation Arctic Fox, aiming to link up near the Kandalaksha rail junction. If they succeeded, the Soviet lifeline through Murmansk would be cut forever. Dietl's men, veterans of Narvik, had fought in snow before, but not like this. Here, there were no roads, no shelter, only the frozen marshland and boulder-strewn ridges of the Arctic wilderness. Supply lines stretched over 500 kilometers back to their base in Norway. Ammunition, fuel, and food arrived by truck and mule, often delayed for days by fog and flooding. Radios jammed, compasses faltered near the magnetic pole, and maps were useless in terrain that seemed to shift with every step. "We move through a world without paths," one German officer wrote in his diary, "where even the horizon offers no direction." To the north, the Soviet 14th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Valerian Frolov, scrambled to hold its ground. His divisions, including the 52nd and 14th Rifle Divisions, were under strength and poorly equipped, but they fought with unyielding determination. Murmansk was more than a city. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience, a port that could remain open even in the dead of winter. Stalin's orders were simple. Murmansk must not fall, not one step backward. The Germans pressed forward toward the Ilitsa River, a natural barrier guarding the approaches to Murmansk. Artillery fire echoed through the valleys as Dietl's men launched assault after assault against entrenched Soviet positions. The 3rd Mountain Division reached the western bank, but found every bridge destroyed, every crossing mined. Soviet snipers, hidden among the rocks and birch trees, struck with precision. When the Germans attempted to ford the river under cover of fog, the mist suddenly lifted, exposing them to machine gun fire from the opposite shore. Survivors described the water turning crimson under the unsetting sun. Meanwhile, south of the Arctic coast, the combined German-Finnish column under General Hjalmar Silasvuo advanced from Salla. Their mission, codenamed Operation Arctic Fox, was to move east through Rovaniemi toward Kandalaksha, cutting the Murmansk railway. The terrain here was no less unforgiving. Thick pine forests, endless bogs, and a maze of rivers that forced engineers to rebuild bridges every few kilometers. Silasvuo's Finnish troops, however, were masters of the landscape. On skis and bicycles, they flanked Soviet defenses, ambushing convoys and striking supply depots before melting back into the trees. By mid-July, both offensives appeared promising. The Germans in the north had pushed within artillery range of Murmansk, while Silasvuo's troops had captured Salla and driven the Soviets eastward. For a brief moment, It seemed as if Silver Fox might actually succeed. Dietl himself reported to Berlin, "The way to Murmansk is open." But the optimism was short-lived. The Soviets had been reinforcing their Arctic front for weeks. The 2nd Rifle Division, withdrawn from the Karelian sector, arrived by rail, along with naval infantry from the Northern Fleet. These men, sailors turned soldiers, were accustomed to the cold and fought with reckless courage. Supported by artillery from the coast and aircraft from Murmansk airfields, they counterattacked along the Litza line, catching the exhausted German mountain troops off guard. Dietl's advance stalled abruptly. His men, who had been living in foxholes among the rocks, now faced counterfire that shook the very ground beneath them. In the Sala sector, Silasvu's forces encountered similar resistance. Soviet reinforcements, including elements of the 104th Rifle Division, began arriving by rail. The Germans tried to press forward toward Kandalaksha, but their vehicles bogged down in the swampy terrain. The weather turned against them. Torrential rains transformed roads into rivers, and entire convoys disappeared into the mud. Finnish supply sleds became stranded, and horses collapsed from exhaustion. "The land itself is the enemy," one Finnish lieutenant wrote. Amid the chaos, several reconnaissance patrols from the German 169th Division were sent ahead to locate new routes. Few returned. Reports came back of teams vanishing without trace, men swallowed by fog, their radios falling silent. Days later, when search parties ventured into the wilderness, they found abandoned gear, frozen food rations, and boot prints that led nowhere. The Arctic had taken them, without battle, without witness. Back on the Litza front, the stalemate deepened. The Luftwaffe's Stukas struck Soviet positions, but could not dislodge the defenders. Soviet artillery, guided by observers on the hills, retaliated with devastating accuracy. Every advance cost lives. Every meter gained was paid for in blood. German and Finnish casualties mounted rapidly, while Soviet resistance only hardened. The front, stretched thin, was now dangerously exposed to counterattack. By late July, Dietl's reports to Berlin grew increasingly grim. Fuel exhausted, ammunition running low, men near collapse. The OKW, German High Command, insisted that Murmansk must fall, but Dietl knew it was no longer possible. His divisions had reached their limit, yet even as the attack faltered, he refused to retreat. Murmansk still glimmered on the horizon, tantalizingly close. In the frozen silence of the Arctic plateau, soldiers on both sides endured a misery few battlefields could match. Nights never came, rest never lasted, and the howling wind carried more fear than sound. The Germans dug into the rocks, waiting for orders that never changed. The Soviets, confident now that Murmansk would stand, prepared for a long defense. Still, one question haunted both commands. What had happened to those missing patrols? The men who had simply vanished into the tundra. Were they victims of the land, or prisoners of a battle no one recorded? As the summer wore on, the Arctic War turned from a campaign of movement into one of endurance, a mystery. The offensive that had begun with confidence was now entering a new phase, a struggle not only against the Red Army, but against the very elements themselves. By the second week of July 1941, the midnight sun hung motionless above the Arctic horizon, turning the barren ridges of the Kola Peninsula a ghostly gold. The front had frozen, not from winter's cold, but from exhaustion and blood. German and Finnish troops clung to the western banks of the Litza River, while Soviet forces, reinforced and resolute, held firm on the opposite shore. Between them lay only marshes, mist and death. It was here, at the edge of the world, that Operation Silver Fox began to unravel. From his forward command post near Titovka, General Edward Dietl studied the map spread across a crate inside his makeshift dugout. It was a map that told lies, rivers drawn where there were none, roads marked that vanished into swamp. His men, veterans of the Alpine Wars, were trained for peaks and snowfields, but here they faced something alien: tundra that swallowed trucks whole and mosquitoes that swarmed in black clouds. "The enemy is the land itself," Dietl wrote in his field diary. Yet orders from Berlin were merciless. Murmansk must fall. The Busse 14th Army, under General Valerian Frolov, now commanded over 60,000 Soviet troops across the front. Reinforcements had arrived daily from Murmansk and Polyarny, the 52nd Rifle Division, 95th Rifle Regiment. and detachments of Tastos naval infantry drawn from the Northern Fleet. Many of them were sailors turned soldiers, wearing black peacoats and sea boots, their rifles crusted with salt. They fought not for glory, but for their homes, and they fought with a tenacity that stunned the Germans. The Soviets entrenched themselves behind the Litsa River, constructing a defensive network of trenches, bunkers, and gun pits that stretched for miles. The Germans called it the Litsa Line. By July 10th, the German 3rd Mountain Division had reached the Litsa's western bank and attempted a crossing near the village of Mafe Bolshaya Zapadnaya Litsa. The attack began before dawn. Under the unending twilight, Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, blasting Soviet gun positions. German mortars opened fire, and the first assault wave waded into the icy river, rifles held high above their heads. The current was swift, the water freezing. As they reached midstream, Soviet machine guns erupted from concealed nests on the far bank. Within minutes, the crossing turned into a massacre. Survivors described bodies carried downstream, weapons and helmets drifting silently toward the Barents Sea. The operation had failed before it began. At the same time, Soviet forces launched counterattacks across the line, striking German positions that were barely fortified. Soviet artillery, guided by naval spotters, rained shells onto the mountain troops' positions. Each ridge became a death trap. There was no cover, no trees, only jagged stone and shallow trenches filled with freezing water. Medical stations overflowed, their tents visible for miles in the unending daylight. A German medic wrote home, "There is no night here, only the light that exposes everything. Our wounds, our fear, our dead." By mid-July, Dietl's forces were trapped in a grim stalemate. His supply lines stretched thin across 300 kilometers of wilderness back to Petsamo. Trucks bogged down in mud, and mule caravans vanished in the fog. When rations ran out, soldiers hunted fish in the Litsa or scavenged Soviet camps for bread. Ammunition was rationed to 5 rounds per day. The Luftwaffe, operating from bases in Banak and Kirkenes, tried to resupply them by air, but Soviet anti-aircraft fire and weather made each flight perilous. The airmen called the mission corridor the road of no return. Meanwhile, the Soviet command recognized an opportunity. Using local guides familiar with every ridge and river, they began infiltrating German rear positions. Reconnaissance detachments of the 14th Army's Scouts Battalion slipped behind the lines at night, cutting telephone wires and ambushing patrols. German sentries reported hearing voices in the fog, only to find nothing when they fired their flares. Whole sections of trench were sometimes found empty at dawn, rifles laid neatly beside cold fires. To this day, Russian records mention several Soviet infiltration units, not heard from again after July 19th, presumed lost in the tundra. Their disappearance mirrored the fate of German patrols sent to find them. On July 21st, Dietl launched another assault, hoping to seize the high ground east of the river. The 2nd Mountain Division attacked under cover of smoke, while Stukas dived through low clouds. The Germans managed to gain a small foothold on the far bank, only to be thrown back by a counterattack of Soviet naval infantry, many of them wielding submachine guns and grenades. The fighting devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Survivors spoke of bayonet duels fought knee-deep in icy water. When it was over, the river was choked with debris. Rifles, helmets, and the bodies of both sides drifting together downstream. Reports to the OKW grew increasingly desperate. Dietl requested reinforcements, but few could be spared. His corps was isolated. His neighboring units in Operation Arctic Fox were also bogged down near Sala. Still, Berlin insisted the offensive continue. In late July, a coded message from Hitler himself arrived at Dietl's headquarters. "Hold your positions. Murmansk must be taken, whatever the cost." Dietl replied simply, "The cost has already been paid." In the weeks that followed, the battle for the Litsa River became one of attrition. Artillery duels echoed endlessly across the tundra. Both sides dug deeper into their frozen trenches. For the Germans, disease and exhaustion set in. For the Soviets, the continuous bombing raids from the Luftwaffe turned Murmansk into a burning ruin, though its port operations never stopped. Amid the chaos, rumors spread of missing units, German platoons that had gone out on reconnaissance and never returned. Soviet reports later described enemy patrols frozen together near the marshes, their faces untouched by decay. Others were never found at all. By early August, the Arctic front had become eerily silent. Both sides were too weak to advance, yet too stubborn to retreat. The front line was now little more than a graveyard of shattered equipment and unburied dead. The murmur of the Litsa River filled the air, a sound constant and indifferent. Murmansk remained unconquered, a faint glow beyond the horizon, mocking the Germans with its survival. But for the men still holding the line, a deeper question lingered. Why had the Germans come so close, only to stop within sight of their goal? Was it the weather, the terrain, or something else? A failure of will, or of understanding the Arctic itself? As the endless sun dipped low for the first time in weeks, shadows stretched long across the tundra. The war in the north was far from over, but for the men at the Litsa, it had already become something else. A fight not just for victory, but for endurance, sanity, and the hope of surviving the Arctic's merciless silence. South of the Litsa River, in the dense pine forests and marshes around Salla, another struggle unfolded. Quieter, but no less desperate. It was Operation Arctic Fox, the southern prong of the Silver Fox Offensive, commanded jointly by Finnish General Hjalmar Siilasvuo and German General Hans Feiger. Their objective was to drive eastward through the wilderness toward the vital rail junction at Kandalaksha, the artery that fed Murmansk from the south. If they could sever that line, the northern port would be cut off from the Soviet heartland. It was, on paper, a simple maneuver. In reality, it became a campaign of vanishing roads, vanishing men, and vanishing hope. The advance began on Sanctions July 1, 1941. The Germans committed the formerly 169th Infantry Division and the Chart SS Nord Division, supported by Finnish troops from the Chartin 6th Division, Chart. The SS Nord men were new to the Arctic, trained more in ideology than mountain warfare, and soon learned that the wilderness cared little for rank or rhetoric. The Finns, veterans of the Winter War, moved with silent precision. They traveled on foot and bicycle, slipping through the trees, their camouflage blending perfectly with the moss and lichen. "The forest is our fortress," Siilasvuo told his staff, but even a fortress could become a trap. The terrain between Salla and Kandalaksha was among the worst imaginable for mechanized warfare. Narrow forest tracks turned to mud in the constant rain. Swarms of mosquitoes blotted out the sun. Rivers had to be bridged, often under enemy fire, and every crossing came at a cost. Engineers waded chest-deep through freezing water, laying planks while Soviet shells exploded nearby. German half-tracks bogged down, their engines drowned. Finnish supply sleds pulled by horses vanished into the peat bogs. An officer from the 169th recorded in his war diary, "The forest breathes and swallows. One moment there is ground underfoot, the next there is none." The Soviets defending the sector were elements of the 122nd and 104th Rifle Divisions, reinforced by local militia and border guards. They fought from hastily built fortifications, trenches, log bunkers, and minefields hidden under ferns. Soviet scouts, some barely more than teenagers, shadowed the German columns, cutting wires and striking from the flanks. Many came from the Komi and Karelian regions and knew every path, every stream. It was a war fought by whispers and footsteps, where ambushes erupted without warning and disappeared just as fast. For the first 2 weeks, the Axis advance made steady progress. Salla fell on July 6th after heavy fighting, and for a brief moment morale surged. Berlin and Helsinki both broadcast triumphant reports of success in the Arctic sector. But beyond Salla, the forest thickened, the mud deepened, and Soviet resistance stiffened. The Germans were forced to advance in narrow columns, often no wider than a single file. When Soviet artillery opened up, there was nowhere to go. Trees splintered, flames spread, and the forest became a cage. Finnish patrols, operating on the flanks, fared better for a time. They struck deep behind Soviet lines, cutting telegraph cables and ambushing supply wagons. Yet even they began to vanish. In late July, a 3-man reconnaissance team from the Finnish 6th Division failed to return. Days later, another patrol went missing, followed by 2 German platoons sent to find them. The search yielded only fragments, a smashed rifle, a blood-stained map, and boot prints that led into the swamp and stopped. Official reports listed them as missing in action. Locals who later traversed the area in 1944 recalled finding scattered helmets and bones half buried in moss. The Arctic, it seemed, had devoured them whole. As the offensive ground on, cooperation between the Germans and Finns began to strain. The Germans complained that Finnish support was too cautious. The Finns retorted that the Germans were reckless and ill-prepared. Siilasvuo himself wrote privately to headquarters in Rovaniemi. The Germans underestimate the forest. They do not see that it is alive. By late July, the two armies were exhausted. Ammunition was scarce, rations meager, and morale sinking fast. In the SS Nord ranks, entire units refused orders, citing exhaustion. Desertions began to occur, a shocking rarity for the Waffen-SS. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance only hardened. The defenders of Kandalaksha, though isolated, received reinforcements via the Murmansk Railway, which still operated day and night under camouflage nets and smoke screens. Supply trains delivered men, ammunition, and even tanks to the front. Soviet pilots, flying from airfields near Kandalaksha, strafed German convoys crawling through the forest tracks. Fires spread, and the smoke mingled with the fog until day and night became indistinguishable. By early August, Arctic Fox had stalled completely. The Germans had advanced no more than 60 kilometers beyond Sala. The Finns, suffering heavy losses, withdrew to defensive positions. Siilasvuo sent word to German command. No further progress possible. Enemy entrenched. Terrain impassable. But Berlin refused to accept defeat. Orders came directly from the OKW. Continue the offensive at all costs. The railway must be cut. Those costs were paid in blood. In a final attempt to renew the advance, the Germans launched a night assault through the swamp near Alakurti. The attack was preceded by an artillery barrage that missed its targets entirely. When the infantry moved forward, they found the bridges destroyed and Soviet flares lighting the entire valley. Machine guns swept the bog. Survivors described the scene as an orchestra of fire and water. By dawn, the offensive was over. The survivors staggered back to their lines, their faces blank with shock. In the days that followed, the front went eerily still. The wind whispered through the blackened forest, carrying the smell of smoke and decay. The cries of the wounded faded into silence. "There are no birds here anymore," a Finnish soldier wrote home. "Only echoes." By mid-August 1941, Operation Arctic Fox had failed. The Murmansk Railway remained open, its trains still running north through the endless wilderness. But for the men who had marched toward it, something else had been lost. A sense of direction, of purpose. They had entered the Arctic full of ambition and left it with ghosts. As the rains continued to fall and the ground began to freeze, the soldiers of the north realized the truth that no map had shown them. The Arctic did not forgive, it remembered. And the road to Murmansk was no longer a path forward. It had become a graveyard, stretching beneath the endless sun. By late August 1941, the Arctic front had ceased to move. What had begun as a lightning strike to seize Murmansk had hardened into a war of endurance, a campaign of mud, frost, and silence. Along the Litsa River, General Eduard Dietl's Gebirgskorps Norwegen clung to its positions in the rock-strewn valleys west of the Soviet port. The Germans were exhausted. Their mountain troops had been fighting almost without rest for 2 months. The midnight sun that once illuminated their advance now mocked them with endless daylight. A constant reminder of how close Murmansk remained, yet how impossible it was to reach. The landscape itself seemed designed to break men. There were no trees, no shelter from the Arctic wind. The ground was frozen even in August, the tundra slick with fog and icy rain. In the nights that never truly grew dark, soldiers could see their breath hang motionless in the air. "We live on the edge of the world," wrote Corporal Hans Gruber of the 2nd Mountain Division in his diary. "The stones bleed when we walk, and the river never stops whispering." The German positions along the Bolshaya Litsa River were little more than shallow trenches carved into rock. They were constantly bombarded by Soviet artillery firing from across the valley, the shells echoing for miles. Supplies came in slowly, sometimes not at all. Each man received half rations, black bread frozen solid, tins of horse meat, and thin soup made from melted snow. Ammunition was scarcer still. Dietl's men fought not only the Soviets, but hunger, disease, and despair. Meanwhile, the Soviets fortified their own side of the river. The Marmputh 14th Army, commanded by General Valerian Frolov, had learned the terrain intimately. They had dug bunkers into the hillsides, laid minefields, and camouflaged artillery with nets of moss and lichen. Soviet engineers worked around the clock, building wooden footbridges and supply lines that fed reinforcements from Murmansk. From the sea, Soviet naval guns of the Northern Fleet pounded German lines, their thunder rolling across the tundra like an unending storm. Still, the Germans held. Dietl's situation reports to Berlin grew increasingly grim. On August 26th, he sent a radio message to the OKW. No progress possible. Ammunition and fuel exhausted. Men at limit. Hitler's response was immediate and cold. Murmansk must fall. Renew offensive. The High Command refused to understand that logistics, not courage, dictated the Arctic front. In truth, the German supply network had collapsed. Trucks and horses alike had been consumed by the tundra. Airdrops from the Luftwaffe could not keep pace with demand, and Soviet fighters prowled the skies. The weather turned suddenly colder. By early September, temperatures fell below freezing at night. Frost coated the trenches, rifles jammed in the cold. The men slept fully dressed, boots on, rifles within reach. When they woke, ice had formed on their blankets. Frostbite and dysentery began to spread. The medical units, themselves half-starved, lacked bandages and morphine. Dead soldiers were buried where they fell. Shallow graves marked only with makeshift wooden crosses, many later blown away by shellfire. Still, Dietl tried once more to push forward. On September 8th, he ordered the 3rd Mountain Division to renew its assault across the Lizza. The attack began under a grey sky heavy with snow. German mortars opened fire, and the first assault groups tried to cross the river using rafts fashioned from fuel drums. Soviet artillery, guided by spotters hidden in the cliffs, struck immediately. The rafts broke apart. Men were swept downstream or torn apart by shrapnel. The water boiled with death, recalled Sergeant Karl Mobius. By noon, the offensive was over. The survivors crawled back to their trenches, leaving the dead behind in the river. In the south, the situation was no better. Operation Arctic Fox had stalled completely near Salla, and Finnish command quietly began withdrawing troops from the front. Dietl was now isolated. His only hope lay in the defences he could build before the Arctic winter arrived in full. "We have become the defenders of nothing," he wrote in a private letter. "No city, no road, no hope. Only rock and wind." The men called their sector the Silent Front. There was little movement, only the distant thunder of artillery and the endless howling of the wind. Some soldiers began to lose their grip on reality. Patrols were sent out to recover lost equipment or locate enemy positions, but many never returned. Soviet records from the same period tell of ghostly German flares appearing miles behind their lines, then fading into darkness. The Arctic swallowed men without trace, leaving behind only footprints in the frost. By late September, both armies had reached a kind of grim equilibrium. The Germans could not advance. The Soviets could not push them back. Murmansk, though battered by Luftwaffe raids, continued to operate, unloading Allied supplies under smokescreens and camouflage nets. British intelligence noted with satisfaction that Murmansk stands. The Germans are frozen. Yet to the men on the ground there was no sense of victory or defeat, only survival. In Berlin, Hitler raged. The failure to take Murmansk meant the Soviets could continue receiving vital Lend-Lease aid from Britain and, later, America. Convoys would soon begin sailing through the icy Barents Sea, escorted by Royal Navy destroyers. Dietl's troops, meanwhile, dug deeper into their frostbitten positions, resigned to endure another season in the Arctic. "We are ghosts already," one soldier wrote. "Only the wind remembers our names." By October 1941, the snow fell heavily for the first time. The Lizza River froze, and the dead disappeared beneath the ice. The front stabilized permanently, a frozen scar running through the tundra. From above, reconnaissance pilots described it as a line of silence. Beneath it, thousands of men, German, Finnish, and Soviet, endured another winter of waiting. For the High Command in Berlin, Operation Silver Fox was no longer a campaign but a forgotten footnote. For the men trapped within it, it had become something far worse, a purgatory. Yet even as the first true Arctic night descended, a darkness that would last for months, strange lights were seen dancing over the battlefield. To some, they were the northern lights. To others, the souls of the dead rising above the frozen earth. The war in the north was not over. It had simply gone underground, buried beneath the ice, waiting for spring. By the spring of 1942, the Arctic front had frozen into permanence. The German and Finnish armies no longer spoke of Murmansk as an objective, only as a distant glow beyond the horizon, unreachable and haunting. Operation Silver Fox had failed, yet its shadow lingered over the frozen tundra like a scar. What had been planned as a quick strike had turned into a 3-year stalemate, fought in silence and frost. The Litza Valley, where General Edouard Dietl's mountain troops had bled themselves dry the previous summer, was now a wasteland of twisted iron and shallow graves. As the snows began to melt, the battlefield revealed its secrets. Helmets emerged from the thaw, ammunition boxes protruded from the ice, and corpses, German and Soviet alike, appeared beside rusted rifles. Entire patrols that had vanished months before were found half buried in the mud, frozen in the poses of their final struggle. Some were discovered in small groups, their bodies untouched, weapons stacked neatly, as though they had lain down together to sleep and never woken. Soviet search parties recorded their findings meticulously, noting locations, insignias, and the eerie silence of the valley. "The wind still speaks German here," one Soviet report remarked. The failure to capture Murmansk had profound consequences. From the autumn of 1941 onward, Allied convoys began to pour supplies through the Arctic route, the so-called Murmansk Run. British, Canadian, and later American ships braved the ice-choked Barents Sea, delivering tanks, trucks, and aircraft to sustain the Soviet war effort. Hitler's northern gamble had backfired spectacularly. The very port he had tried to destroy became the gateway for the material that would one day help crush his empire. By 1945, over 4 million tons of Allied aid would arrive through Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Still, the German High Command refused to abandon the Arctic front. Dietl's corps, now reduced to defensive duty, dug into a line stretching from the Litza River to the Finnish border. The positions were reinforced with bunkers, barbed wire, and minefields. The men nicknamed it the Frozen Wall. Life there was a monotonous cycle of cold, hunger, and fear. Frostbite claimed more casualties than combat. By winter 1942-43, the troops relied on captured Soviet coats and improvised stoves to survive temperatures that plunged below 40°C. "We are entombed in ice," one mountain trooper wrote home. "We wait for orders that never come." In Murmansk, the Soviets celebrated survival as victory. The city, though bombed to rubble by over 700 Luftwaffe raids, continued to function. Workers unloaded ships day and night under searchlights, while anti-aircraft batteries ringed the harbour. Soviet propaganda hailed Murmansk as the fortress of the north. But even as the city endured, the cost was staggering. Thousands of civilians perished from bombings, starvation, and exposure. The port's defenders became national heroes, immortalized in wartime songs and films, yet few spoke of the unending terror of living under constant attack. As the wider war turned against Germany, the Arctic front faded from strategic importance. By 1943, Hitler's attention shifted south to Stalingrad and Kursk. The mountain troops who had once been his pride were now forgotten, left to hold a meaningless line in a frozen wilderness. Orders came rarely, supplies even less. The front became a world unto itself, a static, haunted place where the war seemed suspended in time. Men disappeared during patrols and were never mentioned again. Soviet reconnaissance units reported finding German camps completely deserted, fires still burning, food untouched. "The snow covers everything," one Soviet officer wrote, "even the truth." In June 1944, as the Red Army launched its massive summer offensives elsewhere, the Arctic front finally came alive again. The Soviet Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive smashed through Dietl's depleted defenses. Under relentless artillery and air bombardment, the Germans retreated west toward Norway. Dietl, the Lion of Narvik, was killed shortly afterward in a plane crash near Harz Mountain. His body never recovered intact. His soldiers left behind their trenches, their dead, and the shattered remnants of Silver Fox. Within weeks, the Red Army had retaken Petsamo, pushing the last Germans out of Soviet territory. When the fighting ended in 1944, the Arctic battlefield fell silent for good. The war moved south, but the scars remained. For decades after, locals and Soviet search teams continued to find traces of the campaign. Rusted helmets, badges, personal letters sealed in ice. The remains of missing patrols still surfaced every thaw. Each discovery deepened the mystery of how so many men could vanish in so small a war. Today, the Arctic remains dotted with memorials, simple stone markers overgrown with tundra moss. Few visitors come this far north. Yet those who do often describe an unsettling stillness. the wind whistling through empty trenches, the sense that something ancient lingers beneath the permafrost. For the people of Murmansk, the battle is remembered not for victory or defeat, but for endurance. For Germany, it is largely forgotten, overshadowed by larger catastrophes elsewhere. And yet, in the archives of both nations, fragments of the operation survive, faded orders, unfinished maps, and the unanswered question of what might have been. Had Murmansk fallen in 1941, the course of the Eastern Front could have changed dramatically. The Soviet Union might have been severed from its Western allies in its most desperate year, but it did not fall. The Arctic resisted, not through numbers or strength, but through its own merciless nature. Operation Silver Fox remains a story of ambition undone by geography, courage defeated by cold, and men swallowed by the silence of the tundra. It was the Arctic assault that almost succeeded, and in its failure, ensured that a port at the edge of the world would become a symbol of survival against impossible odds. Even now, beneath the ice and lichen, fragments of that battle remain, rusted helmets, shattered rifles, and bones that tell no lies. In the stillness of the northern wind, one can almost hear the echo of boots on frozen ground, marching toward a city they would never reach.